afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this second evidence session of the Lifelong Education Commission, which is hosted by Res Publica and chaired by myself, Chris Skidmore, Member of Parliament for Kingswood. I'm delighted that today we've been joined by a number of distinguished panelists who I'll introduce in a moment, but the focus of our attention today are on the pathways into and around lifelong learning. Our first report, which is being sponsored by Birkbeck College, is focusing on understanding some of the hidden complexities, the frameworks, the regulations, the legislations that are all involved in trying to make a seamless process and transition process for learning that the government intends to as part of its skills bill. As we know, over the past 10 years, if not longer, we've seen a rapid, if not gradual, decline in both part-time learning, lifelong adult education, that has been triggered not only by a reduction in the amount of investment that's been made available, both at central and local government levels, but also in terms of the changes that came in the 2012 legislation that has penalised the ability for adult learners to be able to access the student finance available for them, and as a result has seen a dwindling in the number of opportunities available to those learners. And it's the intention of the Commission, by taking evidence from those who spent many years looking at this area and focusing their attention on what could be achieved, to try and create a menu of options for the government to consider as it looks to advance its skills proposals and lifelong learning proposals for the future. Last week we had Local Government Minister Luke Hall speak to the Commission because we'll be launching our second report and publishing that with Doncaster Council and a number of South Yorkshire organisations later in November. As I said, this first report is focusing on some of the under the bonnet issues that we think are incredibly important to get right now before it's too late. If we pass legislation through the skills bill and through other vehicles and do not get this right, we will have missed an opportunity in a generation to try to understand what is needed to create that educational ecosystem that allows learners post-18 to move between institutions, to be able to focus on courses that are right for them, whether in work, whether retraining or upskilling, and therefore, this is the moment to seize, to be able to enact the policies that are most needed. So today we have panelists who we will take in turn, and each panelist roughly have about half an hour for each of the four panelists to be able not only to set out their sort of vision and thoughts and what needs to be achieved, what they would like to see in the report, and that could be up to 10 minutes per panelist. And then the commissioners who are on the call today will introduce themselves and be able to ask their questions as we proceed. We have Professor Bill Lucas, the Director for the Centre for the Real World Learning at University of Winchester, who'll be the first panellist. Then moving on to John Butcher, the Director of Access, Open and Cross-curricular Innovation at the Open University. Then Willy Kitchen, who is a Head of Department at Lifelong Learning at the University of Sheffield. Finally, Ashley Wheaton, who's Principal of University College of Estate Management. So if we are ready, I'm going to now turn to Professor Bill Lucas to begin his session. Professor Lucas, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris, and very good to be with you, colleagues. I'm going to speak to you for my 10 minutes with a couple of other hats beyond the University of Winchester. One is the organization Rethinking Assessment, with which Peter Hyman and I co-founded back in autumn of last year. And the second is just to bring a little bit of insight from a role I play for PISA in developing the new creative thinking test, which was to have been this year, but will be in 2022 for obvious reasons. Just trying to get my slides to move. There we go. 25 years ago, I was just about to start a new job at the Campaign for Learning, whose main business was almost precisely the business of this commission. And one of our arguments was that learning was at least as much informal as it was formal, and that there were some fundamental things that needed to change in the school system. And that's where I'm going to spend the main part of my 10 minutes, although some of the things that I say are equally relevant to colleges and universities too. Fast forward from something we wrote 20 years ago. Interestingly, many of the systemic things still not fixed. The World Economic Forum published a very interesting piece by Conrad Hughes, which I'm kind of taking as part of my text here. And it's something about the transition between high school or secondary school and next destinations in that process. Of course, in a world in which we might increasingly hope that we live to be 100 years old, the old go to school, then go to college or university, then work, then retire briefly, then die metric is no longer with us. We're going to have a very different ebb and flow, I suspect, through our lives. I'm going to start in Wales and end in Australia. I think the new Welsh curriculum and its attendant potential assessment arrangements are exciting. I was working with the Welsh curriculum group on Friday, and although they're keeping GCSE in name, in everything else, it'll be very different and potentially interdisciplinary. Some of you may know the commission, the Gordon Commission in the States, 2015, which is saying many of the things I'm going to go on to say myself in a moment. Big Review of Secondary Education Australia has recommended that in order to create a society where lifelong learning and education is the norm, we need to rethink the shift into next stage after school, and everyone needs to have a profile. Parallel work being done by an organization called Learning Creates about the breadth of what we count, academic, vocational, practical, the whole lot. And most recently, some work I've done, a partnership between Rethinking Assessment and the Centre for Strategic Education in Melbourne, from which I draw a favorite quotation about the standardization problem that we have and our inability to get the right kind of nets to catch the right kind of young people who are going to be our lifelong learners of the future, who are going to be young men and women, and then older men and women who are happier and more fulfilled and hopefully indeed more prosperous. In going through the evidence for this report, we noted a number of crushingly unhelpful things that exist in the current system in terms of systems that are predicated on high stakes assessment. And if you're in Australia, end up with an ATAR score, a single score out of 100. And if you're in the UK, 2 or 3 or even 4 A levels. And if you're lucky, an EPQ or the BTEC and other vocational equivalents. I won't go through all of these, but there's good evidence about the things that exams do to some people that make it kind of unlikely that they're going to want to be learners for the rest of their life. And you can take your pick as to which angle or which light you shine on this somewhat trenchant problem. Roy Blatchford recently for ASCL reminded us of the so-called problem, the problem of the so-called criterion reference GCSE, that every year, rather remarkably, a third of young people in the not norm referenced exam fail. Now, there are lots of things we can learn from across the world. We don't have time in my remaining 7 minutes for me to do much of it, but I want to focus on a little bit on the way we do it the kind of focus of it, and to pull us back into this idea that we don't want to end up with a number, but we want to end up with a profile. In the work that I've been doing with PISA, it's become very obvious that even though these tests are actually online and 1 hour, and therefore very unrealistic of what one might like to do, that they are, in their chosen focus, collaborative problem solving and creative thinking, things that are invisible in the school and in many college and in many university curricula. Moving into a well-tried way of assessing people at university, if you're doing an engineering degree or indeed training to be a medic, then you would expect to find project-based or problem-based learning. In the system here, there's a little window of it at sixth form level with the extended project. Interestingly, the extended project qualification has a younger sister, and there's a Key Stage 2 version if you're interested in that too. Not much used, about 30,000, I think, last time I looked at doing the EPQ in England and Wales compared to the much bigger cohort there. One of the things that this commission is interested in is micro-credentials. And here are some examples from work in the States at the moment. These are micro-credentialing professional development of teachers. But interestingly, when you look at what they're micro-credentialing, they are focusing on precisely the wider capabilities and skills that we might want young people to develop. The whole digital badge micro-credentialing world is coming alive here. This is some work that's a partnership with Real Ideas and some educators down in Plymouth. You mentioned Doncaster earlier on, Chris, and that's somewhere where Rethinking Assessment is going to be piloting some of these ideas in an ecosystem of that scale. And they're increasingly used, whatever they're called, in higher education, in adult education, in community education, because they have the opportunity not to rely on a whole course or a whole system or even a complex set of rubrics, but a much tighter form of that badging. In a European context, there's a really interesting set of attempts to be clearer about what we mean by these micro-credentials and how they can be, as it were, stacked to enable, hypothetically, a cradle-to-grave via higher education experience to be there. These are, if you like, different qualifications that we can put into our electronic backpack. But it's a wild west out there at the moment, as some of you may know. There is some terrific work being done by the OU in this area, for example, and I think we're going to hear more about that. The digitalization, of course, is a means of connecting to the process of learning. And digital portfolios are that connection point. And the profile, I believe, is which can be curated in a number of different ways and used throughout your life, a bit like we thought in 1997 when the learning age was our dream, that individual learning accounts might be in a kind of similar sort of way. And there are ways in which we can use them to show off what we can do, to reflect on process, and obviously a more formal kind of assessment. There are some strangenesses in the system which don't encourage lifelong education. You don't go and take your driving test when you know you're not ready on a particularly hot summer day. You don't take grade 5 trumpet until you're ready to do a mixture of performances from those things you've practiced to those things which are unseen, plus a bit of theory, and plus possibly whether or not you can hear what's going on. We at universities have had to move not just from open book to online open book exams, and I suspect that schools will get there too. Certainly Sugata Mitra would argue they should be there now. And there's a terrific charity that you may have come across, Voice 21, showing how oracy can be well evidenced, well taught, and ultimately, if we choose to, assessed as well. And that's something that transcends school, transcends formal and informal, and is, I would argue, very important. There's a growing movement to make, and this fits in with the wider, more less formal kind of learning, to make the process of testing fun. Here's some work I've been doing with colleagues in the state of Victoria, where authentic scenario-based explorations are offered 15-year-olds who are then given feedback on their critical and creative thinking. Critical and creative thinking is on the Australian national curriculum. Because education is a state matter, it depends which state you're in as to how that is done. There's good prototyping work out there when it comes to putting all this together with the International Baccalaureate. Although the IB Learner Profile is a statement of intent, those are all terrific lifelong education goals, are they not? Rather than a profile per se. The XP group, and there's an XP school in Doncaster, working with us very closely in Rethinking Assessment, are beginning to think about a visualization of the whole person. And increasingly, as we talk to employers, they are interested in strengths-based assessment. Something, a profile that is able to say, here's from the Australian curriculum, the disciplines that you're strong in, the know-how that you have, and the general capabilities or dispositions that you're beginning to be able to evidence. The Mastery Transcript Consortium, which started in the States and is now across the world, is beginning to try and, in a sense, give each person an individual website, which allows them to present to next destinations the version of them that they'd like to see, and can have all sorts of other things added to it. Those of us with longer memories will remember the attempt to have a national record of achievement, which existed in the 90s, didn't really work because the technology hadn't caught up with it. We're working very closely with Melbourne University and their new metrics for success. And here's one of the schools exploring different ways of warranting what it is that they can do in a way that they might like to continue throughout their lifetime. If you wanted to look at the trends, they are from left to right globally. And I think there is some learning for the Commission from the list on the right. Because I'm running out of time now, I won't go into that, but you might like to come back to that. I think the key for me are two things: individual progression. The most interesting work I'm seeing here is on knowing where you were at the start and where you've got to, and obviously making the necessary in-flight corrections, and carefully evidencing capability, not always using the word assessment, but finding different forms of evidencing that progress. So my recommendations to you for you to ponder would be that we absolutely need to radically overhaul the assessment system at school. The current GCSE is not fit for purpose. There were glimmers of it in the past that were. It's mode 3 opportunities. They're not at the moment. At the end of the summer tag work, there will be an unholy war between teachers and students and teachers and government bodies, I fear. Secondly, we need a much more explicit focus on formative assessment. In life, we call that feedback, and that seems to be the golden thread that takes us from school to life. We need to develop a whole suite of on-demand assessments, a national system of digital badges beyond the Wild West that I was joking about, and ultimately a national learner profile that you start when you're at key stage 2 or 3, that goes with you when you leave school, into college, into university, into life, and can be used by you as a formative tool to track the development of your own learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil, for that presentation. I really appreciate it. It was an opportunity to be able to sort of share those slides with the Commission also. Before we turn to commissioners who had mentioned, please do sort of put your hand up. I can see Andy Forbes has a hand up already, but sort of unless that's a legacy hand, Andy. So commissioners, please do sort of think through points you might want to ask Professor Lucas. I wanted to actually use the chair's prerogative by asking a simple question, which is around the levels of framework that currently, is obviously widespread across the European and international framework. If we move to a micro-credentialing system, do we transpose this onto the current level 1 to 8 framework, or should we look to create something new? Are they reconcilable? And I think, secondly to that, we've seen through the pandemic that now we have COVID, sort of potentially COVID passports. You have a digital footprint. could we be using existing government infrastructures, gov.uk accounts, for example, to be able to transpose across individual learning accounts? And interested about the sort of systems architecture underneath it to avoid a sort of a plethora of individual sort of software schemes that may not be reconcilable with each other. So those are the 2 points I wanted to ask. Really, was one around the sort of the current sort of framework around the skills level system, whether we need to sort of push that to one side or whether we can adapt it, and do we use sort of existing government IT infrastructure to be able to deliver individual sort of learning accounts?
Thank you, Chris. I'm always wary when anybody says I've got one simple question for you and then ask you two extremely complex questions. To the first, we were talking about this in terms of the new Welsh qualifications on Friday. And where we got to there was that obviously they're stackable. So within the elements of any accreditation, you could have some of what you're doing operating at level 1 and others of what you're doing operating at a higher level. But they're also sizable as well. And I think one of the big issues for digitalization is how big or how small they are. And I think I'm agnostic about whether or not they need to be tied to the existing levels and the European qualifications framework, for example. Especially that's more challenging in with the Brexit context. But in terms of interoperability and higher education, I would think it's highly desirable if we can get there. In terms of your passport idea, I'm deeply wedded to that if we can do that. I'm not a big fan of government technology, if you'll forgive me for saying so, and the patient electronic record, from which I think we can learn quite a lot here. Some of the best ones I've seen are formative, so they're prompting users, not just the owner, the person whose data it is, but also the person working with them in co-designing their treatment. They're prompting them with helpful feedback. I like that idea very much, but it's taken a very long time to get to that stage, and it's still not national. So I don't suppose I need to say there would be an enormous note of caution about that, but it is deeply desirable. If one could get something, that would get you over the Wild West issue as well.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Professor Keith Ridgeway. Keith, would you like to come in? I know you put your question in the chat function, whether you want to ask it.
Sure. I mean, to Bill, it's really the case that universities control in many cases at the higher level, the method of assessment. They understand what 3 A levels looks like. All the courses are really tailored to 3 A levels, maybe, 2 A's and a B type of thing. Isn't that a barrier in many respects to lifelong learning, even getting people into education?
Yeah, it is at the moment, absolutely, Keith, although there's some honourable exceptions. The new engineering university, NMIT, would be one, and the London Interdisciplinary School would be another. And I think, it's no, sorry, this is not meant to be a riposte at you at all, but I don't think we need to judge things by the status quo. I think that the world is moving away from the kind of single discipline undergraduate experiences we have, and therefore the world behind it, i.e. the A levels and vocational qualifications, will need to move similarly. I also think in conversations with smart admissions tutors that in many universities they're effectively simply using that, as you imply, Keith, as a sifting mechanism, and then they're doing their own more subtle assessment. That's why they're interested in EPQ. They're interested in the personal statement, although those are very gameable, I would suggest. And the profile is much less gameable, I would argue. And it is true that universities know what they currently get. It's not quite the same if you're buying from England and you're in Scotland, or buying from Scotland and you're in England. But there is a degree of understanding there. But I don't think that's sufficient argument for it to continue, because I think the world is changing rapidly. And if we simply let the intermediate end goal of a lifelong learning journey, by which I mean university, which I imagine you might go to 2 or 3 or 4 times in your life if all goes well, I don't think we need to have that that rather brutal point at 18, 19. It's at its worst in Australia, by the way, with the out of 100 ATAR score, which makes 3 A levels look sensitive.
Okay, thank you. Good.
Johnny Rich, come in to your question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Johnny Rich. I'm one of the commissioners. I'm the Chief Executive of the Engineering Professors Council, Chief Executive of an outreach organisation called PUSH, and I'm a consultant in higher education. Bill, I'm so grateful for everything you've said. I'm a big fan, and I think that everything you have said makes enormous sense. And to that extent, I wanted to ask you to say a little more also about how what you're envisaging in terms of a profile could be used by employers for matching their needs as well. So it's not just for a learner to show off what they've got, but for an employer, how this could be used for LMI need matching.
So that's a great question, and there is increasing commonality, I think, if you look at the World Economic Forum or the OECD or some of the Centre for Curriculum Redesign in the States. There's a general consensus, albeit not in England. I think we're in a strange slow lane in England, that we need knowledgeable young people. There's some foundational literacies that we need young people to have, but perhaps less than we've thought in the past. That we need some things which might be referred to as character or values, and we need some things that are sometimes called 21st century skills. I don't like that phrase at all. I think it sounds woolly and vague and as if it's the enemy of traditionalists, which is unhelpful. But they're things like critical thinking and creativity and collaboration and the ability to communicate in different media. So I think we know that much, but then we know that when you move, so we need some of those by the time some of all of those by the time we leave formal education. Then in the conversations we're having with employers at Rethinking Assessment, we're thinking about, so what if an employment sector, it could be sector as in T-levels are being designed, or it could be sector as in the law or management consult, doesn't really matter what it is. And if they reverse specify the balance of what it is that they might want, then especially when you've got something that is essentially has an algorithm driven by a spreadsheet and is visualized, you can actually see by overlapping one over the other how close it was. And that's something we're going to actually be talking to Doncaster about, whether we might prototype, because the way we're doing this, Johnny, is not to say, although I personally think GCSE is done. I don't think A-level is done. I just think it needs some tweaking, but I think the current GCSE is done. I'm not alone. John Major leading a rallying cry over the weekend. I think 5 of the last 7 Secretary of States for Education also think it's done. Certainly Kenneth Baker does. But I think that's a very negative message, saying scrap GCSE. We're interested in what we want to put in its place. And what we don't need is a high-stake assessment point, age 16, a throwback to the past. What we do need is some really thoughtful, formative assessment that's going to enable people at that stage to keep their options open, and maybe to do a little more service and vocational internship rather than pure academic, and vice versa. And then if we start having those dialogues with employers, I think this curatable profile could be a really helpful tool. We're talking to a number of companies about how that might work. And it's quite intricate work, because you've got to get the company itself to agree. And it often hasn't formalized the kind of dispositions and capabilities. Interestingly, you have an engineering experience. I'm particularly interested in the way that where a couple of I also do a lot of research in engineering. A couple of the London universities that have changed their entry requirements have switched to almost equal gender intake, and the quality of their master's students has gone up, not down. And they've taken away the tricky maths and the tricky physics and found that there was no diminution in quality. So I think, there's some really interesting, you push or pull that bit of the system and you get sometimes an unintended consequence further on. But I love that idea if we could make that work.
I think this is all extremely important and helpful, and thank you very much. Just on the maths and physics thing, absolutely true, and couldn't agree more. Although we do need to then make sure that students can cope with the rigors that might involve higher levels of mathematics in particular. Absolutely. In, for example, engineering, but I think the balance and the drive is entirely in the right direction.
And some of those people who know they need that for the thing that they're doing have very high levels of motivation, and especially when it's well provided, which it is in those institutions, they learn at great speed.
Thank you.
Andy Forbes, would you like to come in?
Thank you, Chris. Andy Forbes, I'm Principal City of Bristol College, and thank you very much, Bill, for your presentation. I, just by way of context, preside every year over 1,000 young people resitting their GCSE English and Maths in an annual torture ceremony that we have now instituted in further education. And I've been doing this for 5 years, and it's not getting much better, I must say. So I would love some of the ideas that you're talking about to begin to take root. I've been around a long time. I started as a secondary school teacher, and I have to say the diagram you presented, where you were saying the international movement was going from left to right, I think the English system has gone the other way in my lifetime quite considerably. And I was interested in my question really because the proposition, which still seems to be entrenched in government circles or certain government circles, is that exams, and I was reading the consultation, by the way, on next year's GCSEs and A-levels, and I can quote, "We know that all other things being equal, exams and other formal assessments are the best and fairest means of assessment." It's biblical, that's it. No discussion, that's it. And anything else is rubbish. So the proposition is that exam-based systems, and this is what moved us, wasn't it? Moved the dial back towards exams in everything, including, by the way, apprenticeships now, that exam-based systems like career, et cetera, produce the most highly skilled and highest performing students. Whatever the downsides of them, you won't be a properly competing OECD country unless you have a high stakes exam system. And I'm not sure if you have any evidence that could actually counter that very, very strong claim that's been made for the last decade or so, based, we're told, on compelling international research, including PISA, by the way.
Thank you very much, Andy. I think that I counted 5 questions in there.
Sorry.
I'll do my best at a few of them. Is there any evidence that exam-based systems, if by exam-based you mean largely between 2 and 3 hour written exams at one time in the year, then there isn't. In fact, over the summer, I'm doing some work comparing the impact of written and oral assessment on young people's life chances and whether the socioeconomic background has an influence there. And I'd come back to you there. But I mean, you almost don't need evidence, do you? I mean, you'd have to be a very strange Martian who would be fooled by the argument that in order to demonstrate what you can do and how you can apply your knowledge, you are given a largely predictable essay or cut up versions of essays for 3 hours to write about it. It seems extraordinary. And if you look at any other tests of performance, I mean, I used engineering and doctors as good examples. It would be at the basic level of common sense bonkers to assume that you'd be doing that. There is actually evidence. If I take you to countries like, well, interestingly, if you go to Korea and China, you realize it's not so much the education system, it's a system around the education system that is the causal link there. I think interesting, we're working in Shanghai at the moment, who've recruited us to help them work with students to make them more creative and less obsessed by literacy and numeracy. But that's just a by the by. I think middle areas you might look at would be Singapore and Finland, both of which do things well in different ways. I certainly don't think, if the essay question is the only way of proving competence a written exam? No, that is not the only way. There are many ways. Is it a good way of testing some things? Yes, it is. Is multiple choice a good and cheap way of testing some things? Yes-ish. Are there complex multiple choice systems these days? Yes, there are actually. Many that use visual rather than verbal testing. Are there a whole other range of psychometrics you might be using? Yes, there are. Would you want to allow them all to be used summatively? Probably not. Who wants to be labeled a level 3B creative? I don't. but I might want to know in which part of the design thinking process I'm becoming adept and what the evidence is for that. Sorry, Andy, that was a bit of a rant.
Good evidence for us. It's sort of a good quotable evidence. Can I hand over to Doug Blackstock? And this will be the final question for the session, then we'll have to move on. But thank you, Professor Lucas. Doug.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Bill, for your contribution. It's been really interesting. And as a board member of Qualifications Wales, I was really interested in what you're saying about the new curriculum. And I think if we don't change assessment and just go back to the old ways, then we might lose all the potential benefits of that. I think the big challenge for some of the things you're saying, and I agree with an awful lot of it, is that the country as a whole, and particularly in the media and politics, are wedded to the high stakes examination. And we're about to have the annual arguments about grade inflation. And the deep set view that the grading system for school and university qualifications is a means of sorting sheep from goats, rather than demonstrating the record of what students have achieved. And unless in education we can cross the divide and actually have a dialogue with the public and the media and politicians in a way that isn't that's productive and constructive, then I don't think we'll ever move forward. And I think the question I would want to put to you, how can we move beyond these arguments, particularly for the university sector and the college sector, where the requirements of many of the professional, statutory and regulatory bodies for a single high stakes exam at the end of a 3-year course as a means of entry to the profession. The pandemic's challenged a lot of that, but I sense that it's going to go back the way. And I think we need to find a way of engaging the professions in a serious conversation about the best way to judge someone's fitness to practice.
I agree very strongly, and I'm very excited by what Qualifications Wales is doing. And of course, the thing it's got really right for me is that curriculum design, pedagogy, and assessment are all deeply integrated. And although we're rightly and understandably focusing on assessment, of course, it does rather depend what it is you're trying to teach and learn and how you're trying to teach and learn it. I think you're right, Douglas, that the COVID, one of the few benefits of the pandemic has been it's broken our habit, our addiction to a certain kind of high stakes assessment. It may have broken it temporarily in the wrong way, because I suspect in the summer we'll be flooded with stories of either outrage or forgiveness about grade inflation. The current setup in England, I don't know enough about how it's been set up in Wales or Scotland, but it's a recipe for grade inflation. So I would be very surprised if there weren't significantly higher grades. By the way, as the father of two 17-year-olds and a 30-year-old, the 17-year-olds deserve every bit of credit. They've been through this twice. So I would stick out for them and want a well-being index added into that, and also for their parents vicariously, but that's a by the by. I think in terms of talking to parents, it's quite difficult but necessary, because there's a biological evolutionary principle, isn't there, at stake here, that even though you dislike the system, you want your child to do the best they possibly can in the system. And that's been the long-term difficulty, I think. Add to that institutional conservatism in universities, as was suggested by Keith earlier on. I think we've got a problem there. I think, to answer your question, the way beyond this is, and we're going to try and do this from September onwards, rethinking assessment as commissioning a portfolio of experiments to demonstrate that the kind of things we're talking about can be done. We're setting the bar very high because we're demonstrating that we can be done whilst the existing system is still going. So they will be brave head teachers and principals who take this on, and they will not just be from the state sector. We've got independent state school partnerships because we want to bust that false binary as well. So we're thinking about young people, their strengths all round, how we can evidence critical thinking, creativity, and collaboration, how we can evidence oracy, how we can evidence beyond the EPQ and the HPQ and the FPQ, interdisciplinary collaborative working. And we're particularly interested in little small insights we can gain from on-demand learning. That, Andy, for me, would be the most important thing we can do to spoil the horror of your first year of retakes again as you land in your college. And I think that goes back to a very early question about digitalization. You know, we shouldn't be stuck on levels if levels are a barrier. we might like to think of levels as our friend, as a means of tracking the progression of our capability, but not as an impediment to progress.
Thank you very much, Professor Lucas, and thank you for joining us today. It's been really appreciated that you've been able to give up your time today, and we've learned a lot, and I'm sure the inquiry will be richer for it. If I could now turn to Professor John Butcher, who's been patiently waiting. I can see his screen. Professor Butcher is Director of Access and Open Cross-curricular Innovation at the Open University. John, as previously stated, if you want to take 10 minutes to sort of set out a pitch, and then we could maybe turn to some questions from commissioners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you as well, Bill. That was really stimulating. Thank you for your contribution. Yes, I'm Director of the Access and Open Programs at the Open University. So what we're dealing with here are a couple of examples of cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary qualifications aimed very much at adult learners. So first of all, I'm delighted to be invited to speak to this Lifelong Learning Commission, and thanks to Res Publica for organising. I think it's really it's significant at the moment. It feels like after being in the wilderness for about the last decade, people are starting to talk around the sector, and policymakers are starting to talk about the needs of adult education. So I welcome that. Based on my 38-year career in further post-compulsory and higher education, my summary position is that the UK, and in particular England, is in a mess at the moment, and we have an opportunity, I think, to do something about that, because currently there are far too many barriers preventing what we might call effective or learner-centred provision aimed at meeting the need of all students. I think governments and policymakers are infatuated with a certain paradigm of a student. And at the Open University, obviously I will draw on examples from my university. We have half a century's experience of flexible innovations in modular learning, supporting the education of students who are very unlikely to be 18-year-old school leavers. They're very unlikely to be wanting to move away from home to study. They're very unlikely to be in a position to study full-time. And they're very unlikely, they tell me, to view tuition fees as anything other than a risky debt. So we have to be careful whom we are talking about here. I think from that experience with Open University students, I offer the Commission 6 suggestions, and I'll try and go through these now. The first is, I think we need to be very ambitious about our conceptual thinking, almost certainly rethinking what we mean in relation to our current disjointed systems. Without stating the obvious, there are really challenging gaps between informal and formal learning in the country, between further and higher education, and between local provision and national skills shortages. And I think there's a danger that we simply try and bolt on a new system to one that has not served us well in my part of the sector over the last decade. I think the Auger review offered a hint of a way forward, but I think if we're serious, we really need a new conceptualization of life-wide learning to frame any future developments. And that would enable us, and I think without doing that, it's going to be very challenging to enhance modularity, to improve opportunities for accreditation, and to embed credit transfer. We have hundreds of thousands of adults in this country with partial or uncompleted qualifications, and I think that is a travesty, really. So to do this, we need a much more seamless link between what we currently call further and higher education. So there needs to be a blurring of that divide. There definitely needs to be a blurring of the academic and vocational divide. I think we should position ourselves for a much more comprehensive, organic system with clear signposting between different bits of the infrastructure. And we need to think about those pathways in terms of student needs rather than institutional hierarchies. As a tiny example, we introduced a few years ago at the Open University a couple of open box modules, which enable students to bring their informal learning with them and to have that accredited at 30 credits at level 4. They can bring free learning from a MOOC or Open Learn or a course of continuing professional development. And we're finding that is a way of enabling some adult learners to enter a pathway into formal study. Secondly, I think we really need to inject some honest reflection into our debates based on feedback from existing adult learners. What sort of learning opportunities would enable them to re-engage more effectively with education? Currently, it sometimes feels like we are simply offering, indeed privileging, a 3-year full-time undergraduate degree. This may well meet the needs of many students. It certainly doesn't meet the need of that many adult learners. Is quite unappealing if you're going to need to upskill to get a better job or to get promotion in your job. The thought of 3 years of full-time study is impossible for many of our students. And I think it's also a challenge for those adult learners who've perhaps carried a negative experience with them of their school-based learning. And adults at the OU tell us their teacher told them perhaps 40 years ago they weren't up to much, and they carry that with them through 4 decades. And I think we have to think of an offer which will support those students to make that jump back into education. I think our provision needs to be shorter, bite-size, jump in, jump off, modular, customized much more to individual needs, and particularly so if the cost of a full degree is perceived for adult learners as an expensive investment without a guaranteed payoff. So I think we really need to be thinking about what can we offer. It could be micro-credentials, it could be 10 or 15 credit short modules as a norm, which are attainable rather than a 360 credit degree, which can be perceived as climbing a mountain for a busy adult learner. Thirdly, could we shrug off some of the lazy rhetoric around the relative merits of studying different disciplines? The equivalent and lower qualification rules, ELQ, have since 2009 inhibited the choices, particularly of adult learners, and have arguably contributed to the dramatic decline in part-time study. Of course, STEM subjects are important and are popular, but I don't think they should be necessarily used as a proxy for addressing skills shortages in a relatively simplistic way. My careers colleagues tell me the majority of jobs nowadays requiring a degree do not specify a named qualification. We have open degree students who construct their own individualized degree profile from every module the Open University offers, and they tend to thrive in job interviews because they're very articulate about talking about the impact of their studies and the interconnections between their subjects. And interestingly, during COVID, our registrations for modules in arts and social sciences have increased by 30%. I think the ELQ restrictions need to go. Fourthly, there is much thinking coming out of recent papers about local learning needs and how they might be met through local partnerships. I would just challenge the sector to be inclusive of all who might contribute to those local needs. The bill makes much of tailoring, I think they've, what do they call, local skills improvement plans with partnerships between strategic stakeholders. I think it would be a shame to ignore the contribution that distance learning or online learning could make to addressing that local need, particularly for learners from disadvantaged backgrounds. This is especially so in what get referred to as cold spots, where there is limited face-to-face provision. The Open University has 175,000 registered students. They live in every locality of the UK, and interestingly, 85% of them stay local when they complete their studies. So, for example, nurses on the Isle of Wight used to have to move to the mainland to train. Now they can stay serving their local communities on the island and graduate. So just a little bit of interesting thinking there. Fifthly, I think we definitely need a funding system that is designed for the needs of adult learners. Currently, tuition loan systems are a disincentive for many adults. We know those adults are juggling often precarious jobs, often a number of part-time jobs. They're anxious about paying a mortgage or paying their rent. Full-time study is impossible for all but a minority. There's not a choice about part-time. It's the only option many adult learners have. They're often juggling caring for children or older relatives. So I think we need to be really clear about what is currently restricting adult learners from accessing financial support. We need to look at maintenance support and incentivize learning through a life-wide entitlement. And finally, and I'm really pleased Bill and other colleagues have mentioned this already, but we need to learn from the Celtic nations. England does not have all the answers. In fact, England probably has done things worse than anyone else. Different policy drivers and funding systems have led to much greater innovation in the adult learning space outside the English bubble. So, for example, the Diamond Review in Wales has initiated more generous funding, incentives really, for adults returning to education. In Scotland, articulation agreements have offered much clearer routes between further and higher education, particularly for remote learners and those needing to rebuild their confidence and their abilities. And a small example from Northern Ireland, the Open University has been able to expand its access offer into extraordinarily deprived communities and offer additional support because the funding and the policy drive was there. So there are more effective models around us. Bill certainly talked about some of those globally. I would suggest there are even some in the UK. The pathways to more flexible learning can and should be cleared, and we really need to be aligning our approach to adult education with the reality of future portfolio careers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for covering such a wide area, but also keeping it sort of structured in that form, and really helpful overview for us. If I could start as chair by asking a question, actually sort of reflecting back on our first evidence session. The Chief Executive of the Association of Colleges, David Hughes, pointed to the Open University as a cautionary tale, not as a criticism of your institution, but actually to praise it for the level of support that it gives its learners, and to warn that we shouldn't take that level of support for granted. And so I wanted to ask yourself what you felt the Open University model encouraged and inspired in individual learners, and can it be transposed? Are there elements that you see of support for learners that we can take across, take that best practice and expand it to a national level? The danger here is that we look to expand sort of part-time learning provision, reskilling, retraining opportunities, and then it's simply not taken up. And that, I worry, would be a real sort of disadvantage for those learners if the demand does not sort of come forward, having enhanced the supply. And so if you had any sort of thoughts on how to deal with that, given that these learners, having been in the past, have been vulnerable learners, have been the deprived and disadvantaged who've fallen out of the education system and come to it with a sense of trepidation, if not hostility. So how you can grip that to make sure that this actually is the expansion of modular and flexible learning is taken up.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, we certainly have thought about that. I think the key for me will be in two areas. One is in the way we design our teaching and support systems. Because the university have always dealt with students coming in with low, or in some cases no, prior entry qualifications, we have designed our modules very much embedding skills development within those modules, not as a bolt-on, but as part of the learning experience. And we've tended to taper that up. So we embed significantly more support for students, starting with, for example, on our access provision or at level 4 provision, and that then gradually tapers off as students gain those studentship skills to succeed. But certainly if we're talking about students who've been out of education for a while, learners who've been out of education for a while, one of the biggest things, and it's a trope of adult education, is about confidence. And I think we need systems which build up that confidence. They need to build trust in a tutor, which takes time. And they need to know, perhaps, as I mentioned, the negative experiences they may well have had from school are not what they're going to experience in a university setting. And we also would embed lots of formative feedback. Bill mentioned this, lots of short, low stakes assessment to really make sure students are getting feedback on how they progress. So that'd be one thing. The second thing I would say is the funding arrangements. And interestingly, the Open University chooses to set its fees at the lower end of university systems. And indeed, with our access program, for example, we subsidise that at half the standard fee, and indeed use our widening participation work to offer probably 2/3 of our students a free place on the basis of their individual income. We have found that the cost of higher education is a real disincentive for adult learners. We are certainly looking at micro-credentials and at the price sensitivity of those micro-credentials. We cannot, as we used to in the olden days at the OU, assume, for example, employers will pay. Some employers will pay, many won't, and that will be on the individual learner then. So something about the pedagogy of inclusion, building and support, something about getting the initial funding arrangements right.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to several of the commissioners who've raised their hands. Keith Ridgeway, I think, was first in. So Keith, can I turn to you, please?
John, you made a comment about FE and HE and getting them very much closer together. The point you're making is lifelong learning is very relevant for training and retraining. As we're seeing now, people in the skills area are going to have many careers probably. We've lucky to have one, and now, things like vehicle mechanics, energy systems, domestic heating, digitization. There are huge skill shortages. Are we making enough of the FE sector? And is it, if we look at lifelong learning, is that something we should focus on? Because the feeling you get from talking to people in FE is that they do feel a bit of a dumping ground for 16-year-olds that are not successful, won't get A levels. Is it something we should now look at more seriously?
Thank you, Pete. Definitely, and I think that we almost need to rebuild the bridges. I think between further education and higher education. I think the old days of validating partnerships and those kind of slightly top-down hierarchical models are no longer fit for purpose. Really, I think lots of universities have very good relationships with their local FE colleges. Maybe not all do, and maybe different sorts of partnerships could be considered really. But I think what we find in certainly my work in the kind of widening participation space is often as a university that deals with adult learners, we're kind of excluded from some of the big funding suggestions that work with schools and hopefully increasingly FE as well. So I think placing universities as partners in this space, legitimate partners, would be very helpful. And I certainly think that I take your point about the kind of perceived dumping ground for NEETs or whatever the latest acronym is. I think that's very unhelpful. I think much more significant is the kind of strategic thinking which could be through local or regional partnerships, or, you know, I would argue with distance and online education needn't be limited to the local.
Thank you. Andy Forbes. I mean, Andy, I think sort of you certainly were agreeing in the chat to the partnerships, but unless you want to sort of follow up and with additional questions.
I am wallowing in a bath of joy with hearing all this, which is great. But my question is very specific, and that is that particularly given what both speakers have said so far, it seems to me that navigating what might be quite a complicated and nuanced system is going to be very important. And I do worry about whether there's sufficient support for adults or young people, for that matter, to navigate the various options that might be available to them as they develop their careers.
I absolutely agree, Andy, and I think my favourite, rather salutary tale is I was talking about, you know, a university provision for adults from disadvantaged backgrounds at a conference once, and someone stood up and said, well, I work in the careers service for X university, and even we can't find the information about adult learners on our own website. So I think there's a kind of complexity here, and I think it's two things really. It's the complexity currently of the pathways, and I think this takes us back to things like credit transfer, but also the complexity of the funding arrangements. And certainly I think in terms of what adult learners, certainly part-time adult learners, might expect both to pay for a course and to explore whether there is any maintenance support is a, you know, it's a kind of, it's an esoteric area, let me put it that way. So it could be much simpler and much clearer.
Johnny Rich, would you like to?
Thank you. I'm also wallowing in a bath of joy from both what Bill has been saying and what you've been saying, John. It's fantastic. Very helpful indeed. I think there's a big question about getting the offer right to a part-time, and, you know, looking at what we as the sector, whatever that might mean, do to provide something that looks attractive, and what the government does in order to make sure the funding is right. But is there any research on the behavioural economics of the choices that people make, both the choices of those who decide to go into, I mean, I know there's lots at 18 about choosing to go to university, for example, but what is there amongst more mature learners about their choice? What drives those choices? And indeed, is there any research about those who decide not to? I mean, that's gold dust. But.
Yeah, I think that the significant research that's been done with adult learners reveals the change really with the tripling of tuition fees in 2011, 2012. And that you know, frankly, nearly killed off the university, and I'm sure nearly killed off lots of institutions dealing with adult education, because we went from a system in which students could dip a toe into higher education and pay for a module that was quite affordable, relatively affordable, to something where we could really only premise their learning framed as a full 3-year degree. So the qualification had to be the big bulky thing in order for students to qualify for the tuition fee loan. So I think what has happened is people, and this is well reported, have dramatically deserted part-time higher education. And I think the answer for that, and we've tried to wrench this around at the university, is to remind everyone that you can engage with higher education by aiming for a certificate or a diploma in higher education. So you could do 120 credits or 240 credits, engage with higher education, but not necessarily, I mean, obviously that could lead to a full degree, but not necessarily go for a full degree. You know, it's not that long ago that everyone was getting excited about foundation degrees. You know, they've kind of dribbled away. That, you know, we used to get excited in the FEHE space about HNDs and HNCs. Maybe people don't talk about them as much as they used to. But for me, I think it is the much smaller, attainable and accessible chunks of learning. And I think the idea that we can we can give people a smooth trajectory into their studies. Some of my students will do an access module and be delighted that they've demonstrated that they can cope with higher education, but haven't got time in their lives to continue. And that is registered as a failure to progress. But actually, from those individual students, it's been a transformative experience. So we are a bit infatuated with degrees, I think.
MOOCs were hailed as a game changer, but
Yeah.
have they been? I mean, I haven't seen any evidence that they are, but oh, you're muted, John.
The wrong side of it. They have not been a game changer if you are looking at introducing people from disadvantaged backgrounds who do not have previous in HE. So the numbers are very impressive, but many of them are engineering and IT students from the Indian subcontinent, frankly, who are already graduates. They're not necessarily the kind of people I would want to attract. I want to attract them into higher education, but I want a more greater diversity.
Not unuseful as an upskilling anyway, but still.
Indeed.
Point taken. Thank you.
Doug Blackstock. Doug, come in.
Thanks,
and this might be the last question again, just so we can then move on to the third panelist.
I'm always last to the party. John, you're like me, you're working across UK, so you get the benefit of seeing not the complications of devolution, but the richness and the diversity. And this bringing to the Scottish Funding Council's review, bringing together tertiary in Scotland, the new tertiary regulation that's coming in Wales. There's some really interesting things going on there, and I think you've hit on some really important points. But I think it's really important we remember not to counterpose FE against HE, full year degrees against shorter qualifications. We've got to find choice and routes for people. And I think you mentioned Augur, and I heard in a speech, I think it was Philip Augur himself at our Access to Higher Education conference, that the lifelong learning entitlement could be a real game changer. So how does higher and further education help the government progress with that in a way that's sensible? It seems to me that funding on credit is much better than government trying to legislate which courses institutions could teach, but also that regional and local is much better than a single national system. So you mentioned credit transfer. We've got the Northern Consortium, the Southern Consortium, we've got the Midlands Compass. There are routes there. It's better to encourage partnership, I think, than try and create big bureaucratic central systems. And I guess that's more of an opinion than a question, but I could see it all going wrong if we don't have the flexibility for local needs.
Yeah, if I could just pick up on the kind of UK diversity point, I think what we've seen evidence at the Open University is that we've been able to create greater flexibility to meet student needs by working with policymakers in Scotland, Wales, and to a lesser extent Northern Ireland, rather than despite them in England.
Well, John, thank you very much for your session. Really did appreciate it, and a lot to think about there. I'm now going to turn to Willy Kitchen, Head of Department, University of Sheffield, their Lifelong Learning Department. Dr. Kitchen, would you like to begin again, sort of 10 minutes to then, or less, whatever you prefer, to give an overview and your thoughts on how we can enhance lifelong learning, and then we'll sort of turn to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I'll try to, where I can, flag where there are connections to what previous panelists have said, but also I think some differences as well. I think it's probably fair to say that what John offers in relation to part-time and mature, and what mature learners are looking for or need, is very much coloured by the constituency that study at the Open University, where there's what I shall be offering from the perspective of a smaller, much smaller operation at the University of Sheffield, but nevertheless one that works very much with the same widening participation cohort, but on a full-time basis. So my offer will be looking at it from another part of that tapestry of lifelong learning, and I think we all recognise the real, complexity and difference across the field more generally. I was somewhat left-fielded, I have to say, by Bill Lucas's presentation. He's taken the definition of lifelong learning right back to GCSE, and of course the problems that he identifies there, the solutions I have a huge amount of agreement with, and indeed as a lifelong learning adult educator, they're precisely the kinds of assessment solutions that we work through and have done for decades, including to kind of pick up the pieces of the third of students who at the age of 16 are failed by the system in terms of the GCSEs. We're picking up those pieces as mature learners as they transition back into higher education and the skills that can come with that, often without the need then to have a rather more regimented set of stepping stones or micro-credentials sometimes to then benefit from the transformative approaches that a decent higher education can always achieve. So I'm going to have to move on because I always run out of time. I can only claim 25 years experience of adult education, but it was a division of adult continuing education at the University of Sheffield that I joined in 1997, just before, along with many other similar units, it rebranded itself as a lifelong learning department or institute. So the idea of lifelong learning very much is contested as well. So I'm going to offer 3 cautionary tales from my experience over that period. I'm going to pose 1 or it's possibly 4 questions that I think of that this commission and broader debates around lifelong learning and the new entitlement needs to answer. I think I've got 1 recommendation and 1 good news story, if time allows, which is to come back to say a little bit about what we have been able to achieve at the University of Sheffield. So in terms of cautionary tales, I would just start with the pitfalls inherent in seeking to be all things to all people. We recognise that flexibility is, to the extent that we can achieve it, a good thing, and that the learners that we're working with are coming from a whole variety, rich variety of learning trajectories and pathways, that they have a variety of aims that they're seeking to achieve. And when we think about employers particularly and governmental expectations, I guess, funding the system, there's also a rich diversity of what's seen as a valued output from that learning. So I think we have to be really careful not to seek to set up a system that we think can cater for all the many different needs that individuals and institutions and government might wish to achieve to enable flexibility, but in doing so to lose the essence of what I would see as the transformative effects of particularly of a university or a higher skills level education, without which individual packets of learning become more or less impossible. People need to develop those self-starting skills to really engage with, whether it's continuing professional development or individual modules. That this was touched upon briefly, I think, in the first evidence session as well. Can you put it bite-size online and get the foundational skills that way? Well, actually, you need a much wider learning context. So we have to be careful to recognise that transformative learning involves a joined up program of learning more generally. I have the idea of constructively aligned assessment as a critical part of any effective program of learning, and Bill Lucas has very eloquently identified and explained at GCSE level some of the the criticality of getting your assessment right, making it authentic, real world, and the rest of it, and being able to do that, but then to transfer credit between a whole range of different providers and at a whole different range of levels and different times is and can be really challenging. My second cautionary tale, I'm going to have to speed up, is the unforeseen consequences of systemic change. We've heard quite a lot about the perhaps unforeseen impacts of ELCs and of the changes to the part-time funding system in particular in 2012. But there have been some very considerable successes as well. So if we look at the Office for Students Insight briefing just in May, yes, they identify a 57% drop in part-time mature entrants to higher education over the past decade. But there's a 41% rise in full-time mature entrants to higher education. And if we actually package that up into numbers of credits, I suspect there are more credits being taken by mature students today than there were 10 years ago, but via the full-time mode. And that very much mirrors the University of Sheffield's experience, which I'll come back to very briefly in a moment, noting the time. So really important to recognise the mixed ecology, both of programmes and of offer, and I would say in adult learning and education as much as in FE and in HE institutions as well. And I think we need to move away. John talked about the unhelpful distinctions between academic and vocational, and I agree. I think there's some real problems there. I think there's some really unhelpful distinctions between part-time and full-time as well, and the idea that you fund part-time in one way and full-time in another, when in fact any joined up lifelong programme of lifelong learning involves you're somewhere on a continuum rather than one thing or the other, and I think that's created real problems. I think it's really important to recognise, and HE has moved an awful long way actually, both in terms of offering 24/7 services, in terms of offering modular learning. Pretty much every university is now delivering a modular framework to its programme. So there's been some real gains that mature and lifelong learners can tap into if we can find a way of funding and supporting that system that creates incentives both for institutions and for individual learners to take the risk, and it's an enormous risk, and John has identified this for mature students in terms of jumping back into learning and the confidence required for that to happen. So I think in whatever solution and recommendations are made, I'd very much agree with David Hughes. This isn't a zero-sum game, and you don't get something for nothing here. You're going to need investment in a range of different places and not be trading off one area, one sector with another. And I think that's where a lot of the problems have come. Again, I mentioned adult and community learning been absolutely slaughtered, as we know, over the last two decades, more so even than FE in its narrower context. So what sort of lifelong learning are we wanting to incentivise via the lifelong learning entitlement, and why? What's the advantage going to be? I think that's really critical questions to answer. And for me, working with students who have been failed by the system, to pick up on that again, I think getting the roots of lifelong learning right. Well, Bill's talked about GCSE, and I agree with him absolutely. Since we're currently in a system where every year more and more lifelong learners are being produced who have been failed by the system, adult and community learning, that's where we need to be working with students and getting where you can work in smaller packages of modules and credits to build skills that enable them to then make a transition into higher level learning. That higher level learning then needs to happen at least at a program level, if a series of levels rather than at an individual modular level, I would argue. Just very quickly, because I know I've really run out of time. At Sheffield and in my department, we ran part-time degrees for many years. In 2013, 2014, we stopped recruiting to them. They were churning out about 40 undergraduate degrees every year. The students did very well. We changed in 2014 to work almost exclusively with full-time integrated degrees with foundation year. We are now generating across a whole gamut of programs at the University of Sheffield, engineering accepted, over 100 undergraduates are getting very good degrees. They're doing better than the standard students at Sheffield coming in with AAB or ABB. And they're coming from a very, in terms of widening participation characteristics, a very diverse group. So we have twice as many students from lower participation neighbourhoods. We have over 50% of our students from quintile 1 and 2 IMD, and we have 43% of our students who are disabled, 50% are locally based, and 70% in receipt of bursaries, and they're doing better than the 18-year-olds coming in. So in terms of not wanting to see the baby thrown out with the bathwater, it's really important that we recognise that parts of the system actually over the last decade have really worked in favour of the kinds of adult learners we want to reach via lifelong learning. And I'll leave it there. Apologies for going on a bit.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kitchen. And if I start sort of questioning, the point you made around sort of the decline in sort of part-time degree provision with then the replacement to the foundation moving on to the 3-year degree, although obviously there's been improved outcomes for some of those learners, goes to show, I guess, the sort of impact of finance that has allowed then sort of this sort of vacuum effect to sort of suck in students to be on the full-time degrees, the 3-year degree as the model. Do you think universities can give up that sort of addiction to the 3-year degree? Because it still seems there's a bit of hostility to change now that the 3-year degree has been sort of implemented because of the financial reward that it brings universities. And do you feel that universities would be willing to give that up, or would the financial situation have to be comparable to be able to deliver change in HE? I guess the sort of it was been mentioned around sort of how could we have, for instance, like in work learning for those sort of post-18 entrants. We've got the degree apprenticeship route, but that in itself hasn't really sort of taken off as well as many people hoped. Do you think that working at an institution, you could see the end of the 3-year degree eventually sort of happening, or would you feel that it's sort of built up now into such an institution that it's very difficult to overcome that prospect?
I think I would answer by suggesting there is a bit of a horses for courses in the sense that there's an awful lot of diversity within the HE sector as well, so that some institutions would be much better set up. I mean, the Open University is an absolutely classic example. What it does for its particular constituents of learners over a much longer period of time is expertly tailored, and we adopt many of very similar support systems and the rest of it to work for our learners, so that they can access and benefit and thrive in a University of Sheffield setup. I would be very hesitant with my 25 years of experience at the University of Sheffield to say I could go to the University Executive Board at Sheffield and persuade them that they should unbreak a model that has worked for them for many years. And it's a bit like the A-level thing, isn't it? We were talking about the A-levels. Is it the institutions insisting on the two A's and a B that means that the whole of secondary education works in the way that it does, so they can get the inputs that they want, or are universities working in the ways that they do because that's what the secondary education system is creating? So when I say we need to think much more creatively about part-time and full-time, and indeed the lengths of degrees as well, from where I'm sat, I don't think it would be entirely fair to say the challenge or the problem lies entirely with the higher education institutions, and indeed, in terms of trying to explore the possibilities of foundation degrees and a host of and degree apprenticeships and the rest. Institutions have sought to make those work in different ways, but the incentives haven't been there for many to absolutely throw yourself at things. And actually, one of the points that I wanted to make or to float or to think about, particularly in relation to mature lifelong learners and sustaining that, is that the challenge that I and most of the other lifelong learning departments that no longer exist have faced is that business planning has been so incredibly difficult because the rules change or the cliff edges of funding are so inflexible. The risk, not just for the individual learners that we've heard about, but for the institutions as well, has been such that the university executive boards haven't, for good reason, if they're risk averse at all, haven't been prepared to shift massively in terms of what they're offering.
Thank you. Yeah. Any commissioners like to come in, like to raise their hand if anyone wants to? Johnny Rich, Johnny.
Thank you. I wanted to probe a bit further on two things. One on foundation courses and any reflections you have on when they work, when they don't work, how they compare to access courses. The other thing was to think about dropouts. And I know there's a lot of correlation between dropouts and those from lower socioeconomic groups and mature learners and part-time learners. So many of the people we're trying to attract, they are at a greater propensity to dropping out. How do we, they then become a sort of cohort of the low-hanging fruit of potential new recruits. What can we do about that? I mean, I'm talking about HE here because I know very little about dropout in further education, other than I assume the patterns may be similar, and I know the numbers are at least as high, if not higher.
Well, on the I'll start with the second point, if I may, around retention, and I'm not entirely sure what when you say low-hanging fruit. I'm not entirely sure what you're meaning to imply by that, but I might come back to that. Go on.
Only that they're people who wanted to go into higher education in the first place. So possibly they still would like to complete, or maybe they're less keen, maybe they're not lower hanging fruit, maybe they're less keen than other people to go into higher education because they've tried it and didn't like it.
Yeah, okay, and we know from the research for part-time learners, and John knows this better than I. He's the guy who's written the papers on it. Will flag for us the myriad nature of challenges that many second chance or first chance returning to study learner, the third again that Bill identified at GCSE. They're not failing because they aren't capable. They're failing partly because the assessment system is bonkers, and partly more so perhaps because their learning environment is such that there's a whole series of challenges that makes it really, really extremely difficult for them to succeed in the way that the system is currently set up. And therefore, and it's a real, I quite understand why the OFS says, you need to be closing those gaps. You need to be closing those gaps. People from disadvantaged backgrounds are entitled, given the financial risks that they're taking, to do just as well as the students who have gone through a private school education and got 3 A's. But the reality is that the reason that they haven't gotten through a private education and got 3 A's is because their life is set up in such a way that things are more challenging to achieve those. So it's actually really problematic in terms of institutions not taking risks, as I identified earlier. There's a real disincentive to get involved in part-time markets, for example, because you'll get slaughtered in your access and participation plans sooner rather than later as a result of it. That's a real problem. So, if we want a levelling up agenda, let's get real. Let's recognise the challenges at an individual as well as a systemic level that we need to engage with. And then if I can therefore come on to foundation years, I don't want to set up a foundation year versus access to HE debate, just as David Hughes doesn't, because I think they both have real value for different learners in different contexts and in different places. But I think that what foundation years do offer in terms of the risks of transition, and that can be between modules and it can be between levels, but what foundation years are able to do is to enable learning in a specific institutional context and set people up to progress and succeed within a particular learning context. And the OU will do that in the way that they set up their access programs. We certainly do it in Sheffield, and foundation years do across the piece. Actually, they are, whilst the sector, if you can call foundation years a sector, has massively increased, from 10,000 to 30,000 students or so over the same time period that we're talking about. If you actually look at the diversity within those programs, it's like the diversity within lifelong learning more generally, because it's set up for specific learning contexts, and it's set up critically. Therefore, if we think about my program, we interview every student on the way in. And we rather over grandly perhaps suggest that we operate an ethical admissions process. We don't want to set anyone up to fail, because it doesn't help the learners, it doesn't help us, and it wastes money to boot. So it's really important. IAG was mentioned in the first session. For some people, as I say, access to HE is absolutely the way to go, and we recommend that at interview to people. So why haven't you gone? And they will come, and they'll come back to you and say things like, I think Andy Andy Forbes taught, what was it, the torture of retaking your GCSEs. That's become the reality of access to HE for mature learners, caught in that same crucible of torture. And it's not the learning environment that works for them. So I think there's absolutely a place for both and for funding both, but retain the choice, because we say this to so many of our students. Well, you know, you could do it for half the price at, and they say, no, actually, you know, this is what I want, and I know that this is the way that will set me up best to get it. And that goes again for people choosing full-time over part-time as opposed to part-time over full-time.
Be here, and thank you.
Thank you. Final question from Keith Ridgeway, and then Willy will then sort of end your session. But thank you very much in advance, Keith.
Really, obviously very passionate about this. A couple of quick questions really. Is looking at the intake of, say, a typical university like Sheffield, which I'm guessing is what, 5,000–6,000 a year, undergrad level, and you know, you're getting 100 mature learners, if I understood your figures. Do you think that needs to be increased greatly? And are there things that can be done to increase that? And the sort of almost supplementary of that is, you know, and Douglas has made a point in the text is, you know, like because of league tables and so forth, universities tend to like this A level as a brand, almost a brand, an image. And there's a way we're going to be able to break through that, you know, we ask for a good A levels, therefore we must be a good university. It's not really helpful for lifelong learners, I wouldn't have thought.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. That tie between tariff and league table is massively problematic. I mean, we now recruit through our foundation years. We've increased from 2013. There were about 266 across the institution coming in to 458. So there's been an increase of 78% in terms of our recruitment, and we're responsible for most of that at foundation year. And yes, if we could plan for it, and if the institution were willing to double my staffing so that we could continue to support the students in the way that we need to enable them to succeed as massively as indeed they do, then I would love to see more coming through. And you're right, tariff could be in that. It's a bit of a grey area how mature and tariff works. But one of the things that I did also want to just put on the table, you know, at the point that I came into the full-time foundation year game in 2013, 2014, I was having to have conversations around student number cap and tariff at that point. And that was a real problem because other academic departments wanted to be able to take in certain students with lower tariff as well. What would massively help, if we're serious about more mature students at institutions such as my own, might be the idea of thinking about some kind of ring-fenced mature student numbers could plan on and indeed plan growth upon, because you know we've got to a place where I guess at about 150 coming in a year where it feels safe to then double your staffing to enable to double the scale of it looks like a very risky place if you don't know whether in 6 months' time the government's response to Augur is actually going to cut off your funding entirely. That's a kind of a local example of how planning for growth and success is really problematic in the current system, that it's either full-time or it's part-time, it's 18 or it's mature.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Keith, and thank you, Dr. Kitchen, for your time today. Really appreciate it. I'm going to turn now to our final panelist who's been sort of patiently waiting, and thank you, Ashley Wheaton, Principal at University College of Estate Management. I realise we're eating slightly into your time. If you wanted to stay on beyond 3:30, I know people have other meetings to go to, but we'd be happy to do so. very keen to hear from you about your experience with lifelong learners, also interface with employers, obviously the work you do within the built environment, especially keen to understand what is practical and what works. So Ashley, can I hand over to you as usual, sort of 10 minutes, then we'll move to questioning.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. I suppose going last, I get the opportunity to decide how long I have questions to answer for. First of all, 1 minute on me and the institution that I represent, and I should say at the outset, I am 100% supportive of this agenda. I think it absolutely makes sense. I'm totally on board, and my institution, I think, is already been ploughing this furrow for 102 years. You know, we are entirely flexible. All of our learners are part-time. We have 4,000 of them, of whom 1,500 are degree apprentices. They study in 100 countries worldwide. Our provision is wholly online. By wholly online, I mean no face-to-face safety nets, right? It's entirely online from end to end. Our students range from 17 to 70, and our provision at both postgraduate and undergraduate level is all accredited by professional bodies. We don't offer a single program that doesn't have professional body accreditation. So we are flexible, we are part-time, we are online, and we are highly vocational in what we do. I think I've been in online learning and flexible learning for about 25 years, much in the corporate world before coming into higher education. I've also been an active participant in many of the more recent committees and advisory groups, the Learning and Teaching Reimagined group, the EdTech Advisory Committee, and Learning and Teaching at Scale. What I want to try and do is offer a perspective from an institutional head's point of view, but really around what I see as the big theme, which is interoperability. And I think when you start to look at this across the various stakeholders, you start to see both opportunity, but also tension and considerable challenge. So I'm going to try and walk you around what I think is the ideal model and some of the questions that we need to answer along the way. So if I put the institution at the center of this model to start with, and think about the other stakeholders which we need to interoperate with, the first one is government. This whole agenda will fail if the regulatory landscape doesn't support it. It barely supports a part-time flexible institution like my own as it stands today, because we don't conform to a 3-year full-time undergraduate model. And it's desperately difficult to try and represent what we do inside a framework which is set up for something completely different. The second thing is we must have it be reflected in the quality assurance bodies, both the QAA and Ofsted. They must understand what modular and level by level provision looks like. Otherwise, again, those that venture down this path will be caught out somewhere by a system that isn't ready for what they do. This must be represented within the data model and the statistics. HESA must understand that students that are studying only for a certificate or for a diploma are just as valuable within their model as a full-time undergraduate is in their model. I can't tell you the pain we go through in trying to represent part-time students in a data model that's designed for full-time students. It's almost impossible. And of course, it has to fit with the mandate and the first condition of registration for higher education providers, access and participation. If my level 4 certificate students in this new world are not counted towards my APP model because they don't go on to complete an entire undergraduate degree, that will be a challenge. So from a government point of view, those pieces must come together to support this. The funding model must also get aligned, both in terms of student funding, so student loan company or the equivalent in the new world must align. The Education Skills Funding Agency funding must align. We can't have a separate model for degree apprenticeships, which doesn't align with a level 4, level 5, level 6 funding model. And I would argue that we need to include corporates in that, many of whom sponsor students or part sponsor students through degrees. And the whole thing needs greater integration and greater liberalization. We can't view funding streams as separate and distinct and mutually exclusive from one another. We have to allow them to blend together to reach the optimum. We have billions of pounds unspent in the apprenticeship levy, and we have a desperate need for vocational skills. I can't add that equation together and make much sense of it. So we need to liberalise things like the apprenticeship levy and find ways for employers to be able to spend it effectively on what they need to make themselves competitive. So those are the kind of the governmental areas of interoperability we need to consider. Then we need to consider institution to institution. We need to think very carefully about credit transfer. It's already been mentioned a few times today, but we need to think about how we can develop the right standards and the right framework for academic credits to be very easily both transferred from institution to institution, and perhaps more importantly, how they get added together to create a qualification. Who is going to award the degree when all of those credits come from disparate institutions? We have to consider a centralized framework for interoperability of academic credit values and awards. Within that, we've got to find a way for institutions to become more effective at partnering, both HE and FE, and between HE. Today, we have a very sort of federated model, don't we, where each institution makes its own mind up about how it develops, what it develops, and how it teaches. In a world where we want students to participate in multiple institutions' offers, we've got to find a better way to standardize that and a better way to become more effective at its provision. In other words, why is every single institution developing its own module at level 4 for a particular subject? Why not share that better? Why not interoperate better, give a better student experience, and become more efficient along the way? Then we need to think about assessment. It's already been mentioned a few times today, and I really enjoyed the first presentation. Our assessment methodology is outmoded. That's being polite. It doesn't satisfy either the student need or the employer's need. And worse than that, in the scramble towards online assessment models under the pandemic, we've ended up now with 1,000 different approaches. So how do employers and students, for that matter, have confidence in a model which is now completely different than the one that's been tried and tested for the last 200 years? That's a real challenge. How is it that a student doesn't get questioned about whether their multiple choice assessment was just as rigorous as a SAT exam at another institution? That will become critical in getting credibility across assessment. Then as we think about the industry and about employers, Chris, you already know this because I've mentioned this a few times, but we have to think about demand. It is pointless spinning up supply for level 4 certificates if no employers or no industry body values them or wants them. So we have to get employers and professional bodies on board with careers, with opportunities, with membership of professional organizations, which is consistent with a level 4, level 5, level 6 provision. And within that, we will have to really tackle the challenges of the social stigma or the prestige gap between those studying at lower levels of HE and exiting with a certificate or a diploma versus those going on to get a full degree. There's been a challenge with apprenticeships, even though the inside qualification is identical for degree apprenticeships. I think we really need to understand how we encourage people into HE if their intended exit point is only, in inverted commas, at level 4 or level 5. And then finally, turning to the student, I think we need to understand how this model creates choice, how they can choose a pathway which is right for them, how it creates flexibility to study either at one or multiple institutions in a full-time or part-time capacity. And I suppose ultimately, how do you measure satisfaction? You know, we're barely 72 hours after the NSS result, which obviously took a fairly hefty dip in light of the pandemic. But how do you judge satisfaction in a student population that may have attended multiple institutions across multiple levels of study? That's particularly difficult when today all we measure is satisfaction in the last semester of the last piece of study for students at level 6. So I'd slightly disagree with the comment earlier about whether HE is on board for this or not. The comment I made in my own notes for this was think one of our challenges here is that the vested interest of quite a lot of universities, not all, by the way, certainly not John's anyway, but most, is 180 degrees in the wrong direction. The interest is in monolithic 3-year undergraduate degrees, which all attract £27,750 of funding, win, lose or draw. And that paradigm is one that I think is a threat to this model, and certainly a threat to the forward momentum of this agenda. Thanks very much, Chris. That's it.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and I really enjoyed that presentation, sort of looking at almost sort of points of contact that reforms will have to touch in order to succeed. With that in mind, did you have any views about how a process of reform should, the narrative of reform should be approached? So that, are there certain sectors where certain qualifications should be prioritized, rather than have a sort of big bang sort of moment? The liberalization you mentioned, would it make most sense to be able to highlight and target specific areas of employer-based qualifications that we might have the greatest chance of success? Or would that risk sort of seizing the low-hanging fruit, or is actually maybe taking the low-hanging fruit a welcome thing to demonstrate success, and then sort of move into other areas? I'm just conscious, the way government works is that trying to bite off too much they can chew runs the risk of policy failure. So have you given any sort of prior consideration to what you feel might be sort of a prioritization when it comes to looking at these sort of opening up new pathways for lifelong education?
I think, quite honestly, Chris, I think it's a very hard question to answer, because I think there's a double-edged sword there, isn't there? There's a real risk in being selective about where you start this journey, that many students and institutions, for that matter, feel alienated that they weren't part of this agenda. So I do think it's risky, but I also think that we know where some of the prolific skills gaps are. Is it the old industrial strategy? Now I'm not quite sure, but the industrial strategy should be and could be much better aligned with this agenda, couldn't it? If this is an enabler to industrial strength and industrial growth, both post-pandemic and post-Brexit, then yes, aligning it to the industries and the sectors which appear to have the most acute and dangerous skills gaps would make some sense. But in some respects, we're already late on that agenda, because it takes many years to qualify professionals in whichever industry you look at. So in many respects, I'm not sure I would leave anybody behind at this point. And I think inclusivity in this agenda would be more welcome than trying to be selective in those that would demonstrate early success. I would also say, by the way, that my door's always open. I think taking a long look at the models that do exist and thinking about what we already know and which examples we've already got of what works would be beneficial. I know this is part of it, but it's not the most comprehensive view of the great work which is going on across the entire sector.
Thank you. Andy Forbes had his hand up first.
Yes, no, I suppose my observation, I do have a question. My observation would be that I think, Ashley, you've quite rightly pointed out there are a number of quite challenging technical issues that still have to be resolved. And I was listening to the news about Ocado, who's just had another fire in their distribution. I'm thinking online retailers have had a series of technical issues and they're still working on it. So there's something about getting started, something about piloting, trailblazing or something, but we need to make a start, don't we? But my question was, based on your fascinating introduction to your organisation, presumably you're talking about people who've committed to a career in a particular sector, in estates management. And this, of course, we're talking about years, not months. So am I right in assuming that you have students who come in and out of your provision at different points? And how do you manage that sort of time factor that somebody, life is messy. Somebody can be in learning, then out for a couple of years, then back in, etc., etc.
Thank you, Andy. It's a great question, and without revealing all of our secrets, the short answer is our model is designed to be as flexible as a student needs to be in terms of their constraining factors, right? Their lifestyle, their job, their family, etc. So you can go slow, you can go fast. So you can study at a full-time rate of study, you can study at a third of a full-time rate of study. And you can make that single choice every semester with us. So you can suspend entirely for a semester. You can go at 1 module, 2 modules, or 3 modules and do between 20 and 60 credits per semester. It makes it very challenging institutionally to manage that, but we manage it through our regulations. I suppose that's the more technical answer. Typically, we give people 12 years. It sounds like an eternity, but 12 years to finish a degree with us. I would say 80% finish it within 1 or 2 semesters of the intended time frame. So 4.5 years for a part-time undergraduate degree and 2 years for a postgraduate. So it's the regulations that allow us to manage that, and students can pick and choose as they go and make their mind up every single 6 months. So 2 semesters per year for us.
Thank you. Johnny Rich.
Thanks. I'm very struck by what you were saying about regulation and the regulatory framework. I want to tie that back to something Willy was talking about, which was the need for diversity of institutions, many different options and for different learners. And also that speaks to innovation, finding new ways of doing things. So how can regulation better support diversity of provision? And in particular, is it the regulations that's the problem, or is it the regulatory system that's the problem? And then just to add to that, you were later on talking about consistent credibility across providers in terms of the qualifications that they deliver. Of course, if you're going to allow that kind of flexibility that allows diversity, how do you then get consistency across qualifications?
Thanks, Johnny. Great questions. I mean, that first question is one that we could talk about for a very long time. I mean, we are still, of course, early, aren't we? We're not that long into the emergence of the Office for Students and of a regulatory landscape. I think we have to remind ourselves of what it is here, I suppose, to prevent, which is really important, because it is here to prevent, let's call it the lower end of the higher education provider spectrum from offering the wrong thing to students. And I think it's really important to note that. But the risk in doing so is that you are increasingly beginning to, hamstring other providers and their ability to innovate, which of course is in some respects is exactly what the OFS is there to do as we think about a more diverse sector for HE. So I think at the moment it is causing a constraint on innovation. It's much harder to innovate when you are conscious of the regulatory landscape. But I think in the fullness of time, things will level out a little bit and we will see that improve. I think in terms of, consistency, I think you're absolutely right. I think that is a real challenge. I mean, it's a challenge for the end result, isn't it? It's a challenge for awards to be credible and consistent, and for students and employers to feel like what they've got is of the same value as we recognize today. But it's also a challenge for the standardization that we might need to think about that goes across or flows across that whole model. I mean, I have difficulty enough in my own, so in one institution, just trying to guard against the de-standardization of our modules, which is so critical because they interplay across multiple degree programs. But if you play that out across the whole of HE, how does a student get an experience which is flexible, but also understandable? In other words, how do you force them not to learn how to learn every time they move from one institution to another in a more flexible model? And as I say, I think that is a real challenge here, is the interplay between institutions and their willingness not to just invent their own way of doing things and to tend to play by a slightly more standardized set of guidelines.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Would any more commissioners like to come in on some of the points that Ashley has raised in his presentation? Doug, I don't want to sort of jump on you, but obviously QAA was mentioned in terms of quality assurance, and didn't know if you had any sort of thoughts you wanted to sort of throw back on that at all.
Sure, and I guess I was sort of hinting at earlier is that we're now operating in a much more diverse environment and having to adapt what we do for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England in the context of UK-wide arrangements have got to be flexible enough to work for everyone. But yeah, we've been at the forefront of discussions around credit and the credit framework, revising the credit framework, how we can build new types of qualifications. Sue Rigby from Bath Spa has led a lot of that work for us. And Chris, I know you've spoken to Sue recently, and there really is, we've recently published a retrospective on 10 years of working with alternative providers. And Ashley, you came through the degree awarding powers route with us. And there's a lot to learn in there about really poor quality that's gone out of the system, but also really good, diverse, different, innovative, different types of providers. And it's very easy to close off. So the example I would use, it was a conversation we had at a round table before Christmas between policymakers and government, the Department for Education and people in the sector, about what are the regulatory barriers here. So for an example I'd use is, how do you balance up the desire for more flexible, come in and out qualifications and a regulatory requirement to complete 3-year degrees? And there's some real tensions that need to be debated, discussed and ironed out in government policy, I think, to be able to make this work. Because if this is a game changer, the lifelong learning entitlement, I haven't met anybody in higher education yet that doesn't want to try and make it work. I think there's some skepticism about, is it a means of cutting funding, or is it going to try and get rid of 3-year degrees? I don't think it is. Lots of people want to be engaged in it. And so I think there's serious voices in the sector to be listened to. And you know, I'm with Ashley there. Part of where we were all, I think just about in this room, we've been involved in debates, campaign to support the Higher Education Research Act, because we wanted a more flexible system that would allow new and innovative providers to flourish alongside the traditional sector. So I'm very positive where we can go. And I think the examples we've had of the OU and UCM are really, really interesting, aren't they? As ways of showing you can make these things work and you can do things differently. So I'm quite pleased about that. The one thing I would say though is that, and I don't want to get into trouble about this, but I'm going to say it. We have a really powerful United Kingdom brand. And it's really important that we keep the coherence of UK higher education, even though we want diversity and diversification. But then a UK degree still has to be a UK degree. And I do think there are real challenges around how long it takes to be, so you've got a great example there of how you've designed the opportunity to develop credit and accumulate a degree over 12 years. If it's undesigned and unplanned, then does it really become a degree? We've just got to stay coherent, I think. Thanks, Chris.
Contribution to add on to that, and I think sort of I'll probably end the session here. I'm conscious we've sort of run over nearly 5 minutes, and thank you to everyone for your time. I know everyone's got meetings to go to. Can I say thank you also again to all of the panelists who've given up their time to present to this evidence session, to Bill, John, Willy and Ashley, very much appreciated. The evidence session has been recorded. It'll be going on to YouTube later if anyone wants to sort of catch up, and we'll be circulating the link on Twitter as well. But this will be contributing to the reports that will then sort of appear September, October time, and the evidence that's gathered here will be then sort of transcribed and used as a result. So really do appreciate your time today, appreciate sort of the audience's participation in the chat function, questions, and thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss lifelong learning. 2 hours doesn't seem enough, sadly, but it's flown by, and I really do appreciate everyone's time. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Great, thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.